Morning, everyone. How are you? I am going to attempt to do a presentation on high reliability organizations using a pointer that has shown very little inclination to show high reliability this morning. And in Christian's defense, we were both here trying it this morning and it was perfect, but now it's decided not to work. So let me just go back here to the beginning. There we go. Where to next for the Queensland mining industry? Thank you to Christian for inviting me to speak, and thank you all for coming. I think it would come as no surprise that where I would say where to next is high reliability organizations. So embracing the theory of high reliability organizations and going out and implementing it in your organizations. The interesting thing about this is that a lot of people are really trying to get their head around what this means. How do you go about implementing high HROs in your organizations? I wish there's simple answers. There's not simple answers. This is, a part of a conversation that's going to go on for the next month and years between me, you, the regulator, and everyone else who wants to put the mining industry into the high reliability organizational space. How the Queensland mining industry does that is going to be greatly informed and driven by what you do. Because when we ask, how do you bring HROs into the mining industry, it's yous who have the answers. And there's pockets of it already, and we just have to work out how to get the whole mining industry talking to each other about those little pockets and grow it and turn it into HROs. So this is part of a much bigger conversation, as I've said. What is the purpose today? Well, the purpose today is to, I suppose, get you thinking about some of these concepts of HROs. It's much too big to try and cover in the next 25 minutes, but you've probably seen this before. Just give us a show of hands if you've seen these 5 characteristics of HROs. I won't read them out because you can all read. And the question is, these are the characteristics that HROs have, and they become the guiding principles to how you implement HROs in your organization. Okay, that sounds lovely and philosophical, but what does it actually mean in an organization? So what I thought we'd do today is we'd start at the pointy end. We'd go to an organization that didn't display some HRO characteristics. They had a failure, and we'll step through what would that look like through the lens of a HRO organization, and what could they have done differently, and we'll use that to talk about what you could do differently in your organizations as well. And we should have plenty of times for questions after that. But we'll go back to the 25th, We'll go back to the 25th of September 1998, and we're going to go to Victoria, and we're going to go and jump in a car and drive about 200 kilometers out of Melbourne, and we're going to come to the Longford gas plant. Now, the Longford gas plant at the time was essentially owned by Exxon, and it was run by Esso in Australia. There was 3 gas plants. The first was built in 1969. It was added to over the years from there. And on the 25th of September, they had a release and an explosion. And this explosion went on for hours, and there was more explosions, and it took them 2 days to get this disaster under control. The fallout from this was there was 2 fatalities, 8 people were burned, and it knocked out Melbourne's gas supply for over 2 weeks. If you talk to people who were around at the time, they say there was cold showers, there was no gas to cook at home, and all the commercial businesses like commercial laundries that depended on this gas to work lost it, because this was really the only supplier to Melbourne. So massive incident, massive fallout from this incident. What caused the incident? Well, if you take a glass and you put it in your freezer and you get it nice and cold, and you pull your glass out and put it on top of the bench and fill it with boiling water, what happens? The glass shatters. And that's pretty much what happened in Esso. They have a technical name for it, which is cold metal embrittlement. But what you have here is you've got a plant in which there are very hot processes and very cold processes. And you have lots of heat exchangers to manage those processes. Heat exchangers like this. This is number 905, which is the one we're interested in. Fundamentally, what happens here is hot, lean oil goes into this thing, and as it goes into it, it gets cooled down. The day before the 25th of September, there was large gas flows to the plant. They had a buildup of what they called condensate in one of their absorbers. That's not that important, but what it did was it tripped out the lean oil flow to this heat exchanger. When it tripped that out, this thing sat for hours, and it usually sits at around 100 degrees, and if you go and you touch this thing, you'll get burned off it. Suddenly, over a period of hours, it starts to get really cold, and ice forms on it. They reckon it got down to about minus 48 degrees. So now we've got our cold glass sitting on the countertop, waiting for the hot water, or in this case, the hot oil to go into it. When they got things sorted out in the plant, they wanted to restart it. They decided to just put the hot oil straight back in. Why did they do that? Well, it turned out that a month before this, they had an incident where exactly the same thing happened. They found by putting the hot oil back into it, it heated everything up, everything was fine, they got the plant running again. That wasn't what happened in this case. In this case, this thing essentially unzipped. It's Pointer's doing this for suspense. It's doing very well at it for suspense. I bet I'll jump about 40 slides. There we go. So if you have a look at that photo, it's not the best photo in the world, but you'll see over here, this is this flange from this piece here, and it's unzipped and tore itself around. Once that happened, the lean oil sprayed out, and we started to get our explosions after that. And this was our cold metal embrittlement. Now, that was the technical cause of failure, but let's look at, what surrounded that, the human error. This is the sequence of events. This is part of a causal diagram. So what it turned out happened was there was an incorrect operation of a manual bypass valve by the operators. Why did the operators do this? Well, it turned out the automatic valve wasn't working, so they had to do this manually. That led to this the condensate overflow, which led to the warm oil pump tripping out, which led to the cold metal embrittlement. Interestingly, that wasn't enough to fail the exchanger. It sat there. It needed the introduction of the warm oil restart, which they'd done before, to get things back online, to actually cause the failure. Once they had that, they had a 2-week site closure. They had a 2-week site closure because gas plant 1, which was what failed, was so interconnected with gas plant 2 and 3 that it took ages to isolate and find out all the isolation points. There was 85 isolation points they actually had to find and get you to isolate gas plant 1 to fire up the other 2 again. Now, why have we got some yellow boxes? What's the yellow boxes? The human error, or the human actions, or the operator actions. And you see the position of those on the chart. Who do you think Esso blamed for this incident? Shout it out. The operator, absolutely. So Esso blamed the operators. Why did they blame the operators? Well, they blamed the operators because they said, well, this event was triggered by human error. The manual bypass and then the introduction of the warm oil back into that exchanger. And that was unacceptable because these people had been trained. We had trained them to do this right. It would turn out in the Royal Commission that happened afterwards that that wasn't quite true. It turns out there was no procedures to actually turn on that oil flow if they lost it. The operators didn't know what to do in that situation. No one broke any procedures. Nobody did the wrong thing. There was just simply no procedures for that situation they were in. And of course, they had to get this plant up and running again from their perspective. It would also turn out that the operators didn't understand the situation they were in. They didn't understand the severity of that situation. Why? Because it would turn out they knew absolutely nothing about cold metal embrittlement. They didn't know that by introducing this hot oil back in, they'd have this failure. In fact, they felt that it wouldn't happen because a month before, they'd done it and everything was fine. So what you have here is, operators' risk competence. They are not aware of the dangers of the situation we're in. And I think plenty of times we see that in the mining industry. You don't have to go to Esso to see that. So suddenly this picture of blame in terms of operator error or operator action becomes quite different. It becomes much more complicated. And this whole incident becomes much more complicated than even that. And the way we can look at it, or the way it's helpful to look at it, is to look at it through the lens of the HRO characteristics. We could talk about all of these. We don't really have time. So let's grab a few to get us thinking about what do these characteristics actually mean and what do they look like. So let's start with deference to expertise. What is deference to expertise? And have a think about how this works in your organization. HROs have a good deference to expertise. What that means is that they make sure they have the right people with the right expertise at the right place at the right time in order to make good decisions. If you don't have the right expertise at the right time, you won't be aware of all the hazards, you won't be aware of all the risks, you won't be aware of all the controls, and you may end up making a bad decision or a decision for the wrong reasons. HROs are really careful to make sure you've got the right expertise in the right place at the right time. Let's have a look what happened in Esso. Well, remember this gas plant was opened in 1969. They had operators obviously on site. They also had an engineering team on site. These are process engineers, engineers who designed these plants, engineers who managed the maintenance on these plants, engineers who understood how these plants worked. They were there from 1969, but in 1992, there was a decision made to move the engineering department from Longford to Melbourne. That took them out of the day-to-day operation of the plant. That distanced them from the operators. That broke down the trust and knowledge between those two teams. It broke down the conversations. It broke down, very importantly, the informal conversations between those teams. It broke down an understanding of how that plant actually worked and how the decisions needed to be made. Tellingly, there were no engineers on the site on the day of the incident. And the view is that if they were, the incident would have been avoided. Why? Because they would have seen the ice built up. The guys were actually trying to tighten up these exchangers. This was the middle of a major issue. They were trying to get back online. The engineers would have saw the ice. They would have said, this is dangerous. We're probably going to break something here. Let's stop. Let's thaw these out before we go on again. So we see what seems like a simple management structure decision results in a real issue on site because you remove the expertise. Of course, these engineers were able to get whatever data they wanted to help understand how the plant was working. Here is the incredibly sophisticated data. It was paper printed, and it never left the site. It wasn't getting to the engineers, nor were they asking for it in terms of how to manage the risk at this site. They lost visibility on how the operations worked. The site lost their expertise on how to make it better. And I think, if you start to think about this principle in your organization, what structures do you have that keep the right people away from the critical decisions? Simple examples are if production people have more power than maintenance people. Maintenance, we want to shut things down to maintain them. Well, that directly impacts production. Are you delaying maintenance for the right reasons, i.e. because you can from a maintenance perspective or the production challenge is too big? And we could go on and on about this, but have a think about your organization. Have you got the people with the right expertise doing your risk assessments? If they don't, then it's just a paperwork process that really isn't going to keep your people safe. Let's grab another one. So this time round, let's take a sensitivity to operations. What's a sensitivity to operations? Well, HROs know that the world is complicated and the way they work is complicated and that it's impossible to plan out everything in every last detail. It's impossible to put a system in place that will work every single time and deal with every eventuality. I would say that a lot of the mining industry believes it is possible to do that. But HROs believe that's impossible. So what HROs do is they know the way work will actually be done is not the way work was intended to be done. It'll be done in practice different to the procedures. So what HROs do is rather than police people back to the procedures, they go out and find out how the work is actually done. They have a sensitivity to operations. And it's not just the leaders understanding how some of the frontline workers are working. This is a collective mindfulness of this is how the organization works. They understand it won't work the same way it does on paper, and they chase to make sense of that. Let's have a look from Longford. Again, we can pick many things here. This is the typical station that an operator sits at. There's a massive wall behind them full of other instruments and alarms. This is their alarm panel, which tells them whether something is not working properly in the plant. And I mean, if we start getting alarms in the plant, what does that mean? Well, it means the plant is operating outside its normal limits. means the plant is behaving in a way that wasn't intended on paper, essentially. What did they find in the Royal Commission? Well, they found in the Royal Commission that very regularly the operators on site in Longford ran this plant in what they called alarm mode. That's a very fancy term to say alarms were going off all the time and everyone kept doing what everyone was doing. To give you an idea of the extent of the problem, on an average day in the plant, you would have 300 to 400 alarms going off per day. That's when there's no incidents happening. If an incident happened, they had one incident, and this is not the explosion, but they had one incident that happened, and there was 8,500 alarms on that day. That's 12 alarms every minute. So it's an alarm every 60 seconds. And these operators were meant to process that and manage it. And of course, what happened was, what do we do in that situation? When more alarms are going off than we can cope with, when more warning signals are coming at us than we can cope with, we adapt, we normalize it. And when we say normalize here, we've got to be careful. It doesn't just mean we get used to it. With every alarm that goes off and nothing bad happens, we say, well, that's more proof that nothing bad will probably happen. I can safely start ignoring all these alarms. So all the alarms that were telling them, giving them information that the plant was not working as intended, had now been normalized. Part of the problem was the absence of engineers, because they were all in Melbourne. They weren't walking into the plant and go, really, is this how this place works? Because it's not how it works in my head, and it's not how it works as far as I'm concerned, but this is how it's working. Why were operators working it like this? Well, their production targets were really real. They had to produce a certain quantity and quality of gas all the time, and that's what they did. To do that, they had to operate the system outside its limits. And again, I reckon if you go to your mine, you're going to see plenty of this sort of stuff going on as well. And it's not even that we set production targets that force people to go outside the limits. Sometimes we just design crap systems. And what you actually found here in Longford is that it was impossible to actually operate the plant without breaking the rules. The reason was somebody designed gas plant 1, then added gas plant 2, gas plant 3. They start putting in different pieces of kit, pulling out pieces of kit. The way the plant worked on paper, it could not possibly work in real life the same way. To actually operate it, you had to go outside the rules. And again, there'll be plenty of procedures in your mind that will force people outside the rules, even if you don't intend that. So again, the reason why people are outside alarms is complicated, and there's a lot going on. And what we have is a complete breakdown in a sensitivity to operations, because the plant is running in a completely different way to how you imagine it running. And there'll be plenty of mines that are exactly the same. The way work is done on the ground is quite different from the way people think work is done. What's the issue with that? Well, if people are doing work differently than you intend, there are new hazards you know nothing about. If you know nothing about them, you can't manage them. If people are doing it in different ways, especially in a complex environment like a mining environment, then there'll be interactions that nobody talked about. The challenge for you, if we look at a sensitivity to operations, is to go back and say, how do we, in our mind sight, be sure we actually understand how the work's getting done? And this is a really important point. You're not understanding how the work's getting done so you can police people back to compliance. You're understanding how the work's really done so you can get the formal procedures to catch up with the informal procedures. Because if you do that, you can make sure the informal procedures are safe and that you have a full picture of what's happening in your organization. This collective mindfulness is key. The last one we'll talk about very briefly is a preoccupation with failure. This is something called chronic unease, like Mark mentioned. HROs don't pat themselves on the back with success. HROs know they work in a complex and hazardous environment. They know that the next failure is just around the corner. They are interested in their hazards that they find, the incidents that are happening. They're interested in learning from them and putting actions in place to stop them happening again. Even more than that, they're interested in what they call the weak signals, the precursors that something's going to go wrong. That can be a drop in reporting. If people aren't reporting, are we hiding things? So let's have a look at Longford. What was happening in Longford? And there's so many aspects of Longford we can talk about here, the relationship between Exxon and Esso and lots of different levels. But the key one we want to talk about is reporting. And Mark's already talking about reporting, and this is probably one of the biggest and most confronting sort of bugbears about HROs. We just had a catastrophic incident at Esso. What sort of reports, what sort of warnings did we have that this could happen? Well, what did Esso focus on? Anyone want to shout out what you reckon Esso focused on? TRIF? Yeah. LTIs, close enough. You know, one bad measure is as good as another. So please keep the idea of TRIF in your head as we talk about LTIs. They focused on LTIs. They focused on LTIs to such a degree that they got really, really good at it. The year before the incident, in 1997, they had 0 LTIs. Absolutely 0. Stunning performance. And this wasn't a flash in the pan. Back in as soon as I can get it up, 93, they celebrated doing 5 million hours work with 0 LTIs. Terrific. They even won an award for that. At the same time as they were talking about doing so well, they were also in the newsletter to the workers saying there's a concerning increase in slips and trips, and they talked about how someone had fell down the stairs and had been medevaced off the site. But good news was no LTI. And what does this do? Well, this does, and we see this in every industry, it distracts people. You know, while they were focused completely on LTIs and saying safety was the first priority, they were missing the major incidents, the things that could kill people, the precursors to what could kill people, because those things do not get caught in the LTIs and the TRIF. They're almost useless in terms of predicting the really bad incidents. Process upsets, which would have told them, hey, we got ice on a heat exchanger a month ago. They did not record those sorts of incidents well, and they did not investigate those incidents well. They checked whether production was affected at the end. Are we still delivering the quantity and quality of gas we should be doing? As they did that, and that was a good outcome, they assumed that the process that led to that outcome was in and of itself good as well. We as human beings do this. Companies love doing this. If we keep producing, then we say that, well, the process we're using to producing must be good. Often, the corners that people have to cut to keep process going can be very bad. So much more complicated than that. They had that near miss a month ago. As we said, this would have really been a precursor event to say you needed to do something well. As I said, these things are a distraction. Even worse, as you move up through organizations, these things become, create this false sense of security. They tell executives that everything's going well in the company. If you're focused on TRIF, you're not, and you're focused on TRIF exclusively, then you're not probably managing your major hazards that are really going to hurt and kill people and blow stuff up. We see this in failure after failure after failure. This is probably one of the most confronting debates the industry has to have about HROs, because from the front line to the boardroom table, nobody likes TRIF numbers going up. People concentrate on it, and we're missing big things because of that. And of course, it's how companies benchmark each other against them as well. So have a really deep think about this. To be a HRO, you need to understand, with a preoccupation with failure, what is going wrong in your organization. If every metric you have for reporting drives down that reporting, you are not going to get the information you need to manage your hazards properly. You're going to be blinded to those hazards, and that's where things go wrong. We have to flip that on its head, which is what's going back to what Mark says, and we have to get more reports on hazards and incidents, particularly the nasty stuff, the strata failures, the gas exceedances, the stuff that really kills people. And one of the biggest conversations, that has to be had with industry and the regulator is, Mark says, if you report, if we get our reporting up inside our companies, you will report more HPIs. But you can't say to your workers, we want more reports except the really bad stuff that we have to tell the regulator. You can't do that, because people then just don't report anything. So you need to get that reporting up. You will have more HPIs. You need to know how the regulator will react to that and what that conversation will be. My advice would be, keep asking the regulator. The tension's unbelievable, isn't it? I keep expecting it to jump halfway through Jason Economidis' presentation later on. There we go. This is what the causal diagram of SO actually looks like. You saw everything below the line. Look at how many things had to go wrong at a system level within SO to cause this explosion and cause those 2 fatalities. You'll see lots of things we talked about, the absence of the engineers, the focus on the LTIs, but you'll see a lot of other things that we didn't talk about as well from a timing perspective. We found in the review that many, many things have to go wrong for fatalities to occur. We see that in every organizational failure. And HROs are all about trying to catch that before it happens. How do they do that? You know, where do you start if you're a HRO? Or if you want to be a HRO? Well, where you start is you say, where am I now? And a lot of people feel, you know, do I have to kick out my whole system? Another safety idea? So I have to go and throw out my system and grasp this new safety idea? No, you don't. That's one of the beauties of HPIs or HROs. You start, now it's been too good. You start with your existing system and you ask yourself, why is my existing system not producing the outcomes I actually want? You all will have reporting systems. You'll talk to people about the importance of reporting. You'll talk to people about the importance of investigating and understanding the causes of those incidents. But if you look at your systems, you may not be getting the reports of the really nasty, dangerous things, the things with the potential to really hurt your people. Why? And the answer will be lots of complicated things, but this is where you apply the HRO principles like a preoccupation with failure to understand that. The things that are stopping you becoming a HRO, and we could put 20 or 30, you know, there are things like the personal safety only focus of TRIF. Are you actually capturing the information you want? Or is the drive to keep things like TRIF down actually affecting your ability of people to report? Because what you're really saying is, please don't report bad stuff to me. You know, there's the view in mining, and I think, how many engineers have we got in the room? A few engineers. I'm an engineer, so I can take a pot shot at us as well. You know, engineers love to build systems. We love it. And we love to build perfect systems because we're engineers, and that's what we do. But we don't build perfect systems here. But one of the big challenges I see in the mining industry is there is the view that we can build perfect systems. We build perfect systems, we put procedures in place to keep people safe. If only people would follow the procedures, then they'd be safe. And we know that doesn't happen. It's much more complicated than that. And as you've seen from ESO, the reasons why people don't follow procedures and follow the systems is very complicated, and they're system problems. And that's what HROs are about, is identifying those system problems. And reporting, for a lot of cases, is about compliance. It's about where did we not comply. And if you try and break HROs down to one specific thing, you know, in your organization, it's really about saying, are you a learning organization? And to be a learning organization, actually learning how you do what you do, means you have to do a few very uncomfortable things. You have to embrace bad news. You have to see reporting as a learning opportunity to understand why your system is not working the way you think it is. What I sometimes say is we design companies to push information down. Good HROs have got practices, and the key word there is practices, to feed information back up, to tell you when your system's not working, and then your job is to action that, to bring everything back into line again. And when you do, it'll slip again tomorrow, because that's the nature of the beast. Be aware there's some massive elephants in the room here, massive challenges. One of these is, you know, companies are structured to not let bad news flow up. You know, we don't like to tell our boss that everything's crap. You know, the people who raise all these issues tend to be named the troublemakers. And no CEO wants to go to the board and say, good news, incident reports are up. Someone said to me once, a board does not like to see any safety line going up. They want every safety line going down. And there's an education piece around that where we have to, on every level in the companies, try and change that. But we need bad news to flow. That's one of the key characteristics for a good HRO. Bad news flows very freely. There's a lot of psychological safety, and there's good systems to capture it and put it on the right people's desk. If you are a senior leader, and you are thinking, well, I want to get more bad news and I don't seem to be getting any bad news, where do you start? Well, go and look for where you're getting a continuous flow of good news. Start with your critical control audits properly. You know, they'll probably be lovely and green. They're probably not. Go and find out why they're not working. Because again, the pressure to green those sorts of things becomes really, really important. Bobby Foote calls them watermelons, things that are green on the outside and red on the inside. But everyone likes to serve up watermelons to the board because the board likes things that are green. A big discussion around that to be had. This is all about, at its fundamental, get the bad news, which we don't tend to be good at, and take action on that bad news. That's what makes us a learning organization. As we wait, yep. That's what makes us a learning organization, and that is fundamentally what HROs are. If you're a learning organization, you have the capability to anticipate and manage unexpected events. Why? Because you know about them, because the information is flowing back up to you to manage them. Not only are HROs learning organizations, they are what I would call learning and relearning organizations. They're constantly trying to work out, this is how we think the company works, how is it actually working? And what information do we get to make that happen? If you're interested in more information on Longford, it's a fantastic read. It's a fantastic intro to HROs. They talk a lot about HRO theory in it by Andrew Hopkins. Have a read of that. As Mark said, a shameless plug for the podcast. In episodes 5 and 6, we talk a lot about HROs. We talk to people in industry who have implemented different parts of HROs. And this is really where I think the key is. If we can get the mining industry sharing with one another about what you're doing in HROs, because everyone's going to tackle a different bit first, then that gives you an opportunity for the whole industry to grow. While we're at it, we'll do another shameless plug. If you're around on Monday before lunch, myself and Jody Goodall, who works with me, we're doing a 3-hour workshop on HROs where we'll get much more practical and much more into the weeds of this stuff to try and understand how you go about implementation, because there are tools that you can use in your organization to help you do that. We're doing it with a regulator because I think that's a key part of this process, that we all have very grown-up conversations about how we all go on this HRO journey to make things safer. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean. We've got 8 minutes for questions. There's a squillion here, so we won't get through them all. But the voted up ones, we'll start with this one. So from John Williamson, sensitivity operations. When management looks at the difference between documented process and the actual method of work, what do they do next?
I think they don't, well, what happens is they don't ask the deeper questions. So the real question is the why. If something is not being done according to the procedures, I think what we see is certainly you will have people who will just do things wrong from time to time, but the majority of people who deviate for good reasons. They deviate because it makes them more efficient. They deviate because the procedure doesn't work properly. They deviate because there was unintended combinations with other things. And once they deviate and it works, they normalize that deviance that we talked about before. And once they normalize it, they go, well, this worked before, I'll keep doing it. And they'll often make those decisions based on a local risk assessment. They will try and do it safely. So I think that for a senior person, understanding the why that is happening is key. What is the system reason that makes the person want to do that? That's not a bad approach for almost anything. What is the system reason to make someone want to behave the way they're behaving? If people aren't reporting, what's the system reason why they're not reporting? And follow that sort of line through.
Next one's from Alex. HRO requires redundancy is built into a system. How would you convince a business not to remove that when things are going well for a cost saving?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the key things about HRO. You're either giving it a shot or you're not. You're serious about it or you're not. And you need people to do certain things in there. You need resources to make it happen. But the key thing about HROs is, well, what's the upside of that? Well, it's easy to say, oh, well, we'll get safer. But if you think about the word high reliability organizations, the word safety doesn't appear in it at all. HROs are all about getting more predictability back into their organizations. What does that mean? That when they do something, they know what happens. How do they get more predictability? They become learning organizations. When you know more about how your organization actually functions on the ground, you can get a whole lot more predictable what it does. That will give you a whole range of benefits that are not safety related. Better performance, more efficiency, more reliability. The key thing about HROs is better safety is an outcome of HRO. It's not a component of HRO. So that's the head shift, I think, Christian, that has to take place, is that it's not just, oh, I need to cut back here and I'll cut back on this HRO thing from a safety perspective and get a little bit leaner. It's, if you're really serious about HRO, you're also going to be cutting back on a whole pile of very positive benefits for your business that are not just safety related.
Next question. Protection of injury rates is what drives incidents down playing. The fear of losing zero, in inverted commas, creates a blame culture without owning an organizational failure.
Yeah, I mean, this is almost key, isn't it? I mean, anything that drives down reporting, you just got to hunt it down and kill it in your organization, because that's cutting back your information. I think the way I think about reporting is people go, well, we don't want to hurt people, therefore we'll put the TRIF in or we'll put some sort of measure in. The key assumption that people don't say in there is that that's only valid as long as everything gets reported. But the minute you decide and put in a metric and then put downward pressure on that metric, either officially or unofficially, what you're doing is you're making people do what they do. They start hiding stuff to keep that metric low. So when you say to people, we want our TRIF down, what you're really saying is we want the number of reports down. We want you to report less to me. And this is a conversation, that has to happen at the front line and go all the way up to the boardroom and beyond. It's absolutely critical we get this right. We need the bad information, and we have to stop treating reporting as bad information. It is bad information, but we want the bad news to make changes and action on it. Yep.
Similar along the lines of reporting, what do you think we should be focused on reporting-wise proactively, if not injury indicators?
Focus on how your organization actually works. There's a whole pile of other metrics you can use, some negative, some positive. Andrew Hopkins says, find the precursor events. Actually analyze your data for the precursor of the little failures that happen. And make sure they happen often enough that you can count them. So that's important. There's a whole bunch of lead indicators we could talk about, but we also talk in terms of what happens in production. What about the normal operation of your business? Because I think it's where you look at all those metrics that you start to say, well, how do people behave if the long wall goes down for 3 or 4 days? If we keep breaking things, what happens? What's the relationship between preventative maintenance and reactive maintenance? Keep an eye on that, see how that goes. Hopkins says that maintenance departments are just hotbeds for learning in these organizations because they're the front line of where loads of things are going wrong. So there's a whole range of measures. It's going to be specific to your company and your industry, and it's about finding the right one. But you've got to look at your own data to work out how to do that. But it's not one metric. If you went to a board and said, here, please measure safety with just TRIF or just this measure, okay. Now, please measure the financial health and future of the company with just one measure. The board will go, but that's absolutely crazy. We need to look at interest rates, we need to look at this, we need to look at this, we need to look at this, we need to look at this. Yes, you do. Same applies for safety. We can't boil this down to just one number.
Okay, and keeps moving on me, but I'll go for this one. So less than 30 seconds. So from Cass Jensen, do you think the mining industry and regulator are ready for the radical transparency needed in reporting to actually achieve zero serious harm?
Well, that's not a question for me, really. It's a question for all of you. I think there's a hunger for it. I think the fact that people are still interested in HROs a year on from the report is really, really important. There was a session on HROs in UQ a month or so back. There was 120 people. There was another 100 people online. People are hungry for change. What we need to do is figure out how to actually make that change happen. If the boards want TRIF, we have to find out how to have a conversation with the boards to change that. If the regulator wants to drive down HPIs, we have to have a conversation with the regulator. They don't. Everyone's worried about reporting to the regulator. We were at the Underground Mine Managers Forum and the SSE Forum a couple of weeks ago, and with this amazing discussion where people just peppered the chief inspector for metal mines about, if I report this sort of HPI, what happens? If I do this, what happens? Are you going to close my site for 2 days? How does this work? Have those conversations. Ask what happens. You know, if you follow, as we said, if you go down the path of HPI and improve your internal reporting, you can't say to people, we want only certain type of reports. You want them all. You're going to have more HPIs. You're going to be talking to Herman or Peter about those more HPIs. Ask what that conversation is going to be like before it starts. They want to have that conversation. So I do think people are ready. I think we've got massive cultural issues to deal with. I think we have to believe we can change. The regulators changing. We've got to change how boards think. We've got a lot to do. But the thing we have to remember is there are many, many other industries who have been where you are right now, and they've gone down the HRO path. There's a way of doing this. But we just have to tackle that all together to make it work. And you got to get better at sharing. You know, we all say there's loads of legal impediments to sharing. You go and you talk to the frontline workers, they all want to know how someone got hurt in another mine. They want to know. We have to sit down with the lawyers and figure out how we can start sharing. The oil and gas industry have done it with their Safer Together program. They report all their incidents into an industry-based body that anonymizes those and pushes them back out in learnings to the industry. We have to believe that we can do that in mining. If we do, then things will start to improve. But there's going to have to be a whole bunch of people who are going to have to be willing to fight for this and rock the boat.
Okay, can you please thank Sean Brady?